Good evening. My name is Chip Horton, and I'm an MBA candidate at West Texas A&M University in the Seminar and Leadership class. And this is a presentation on famous leaders, in this case, Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States. There have been many great leaders throughout history, from Abraham Lincoln to Steve Jobs. But one of those of the most famous and the most influential was Theodore Roosevelt. Interestingly, as he was a child, 6 years old, he witnessed the funeral procession of Abraham Lincoln when he was assassinated. He was influenced by his father greatly, who took him on trips and taught him how to be a leader and accepted nothing less than perfection from him. Roosevelt developed a love for zoology and started his own museum with a couple of cousins when he was 6 years old. He eventually ascended to the New York State Assembly, operated his own ranch. He was part of the U.S. Civil Service Commission, and then eventually became the New York City Police Chief, or Police Commissioner. He ascended to the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and formed the first U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, better known as the Rough Riders, and led their procession into Cuba as part of the Spanish-American War. He eventually was governor of New York, and then was the Vice President of the United States. Before the president was assassinated, he became president for a little over 8 years. He was a fantastic leader. We're going to talk about some of his strengths and some of his weaknesses as a leader. First of all, as a child, he was very sickly, and he experienced a lot of asthma and had a lot of things to overcome. He was an emergent leader, and one of the interesting things about him, he said, is, if I have anything left at all resembling genius, it's in the gift of leadership. To tell the truth, I like to believe that by what I have accomplished without great gifts, I may be a source of encouragement to Americans. Interestingly, as much ego as Roosevelt had, he was very humble at times. He believed that leaders were created, not born. And he developed a lot of courage through his youth and through his college years. Another one of his quotes, he says, there were all kinds of things that I was afraid of at first, ranging from grizzly bears to mean horses and gunfighters, but by acting as if I was not afraid, I gradually ceased to be afraid, which I think is an interesting quote. Again, as he grew up as a sickly child with asthma, he overcame those things. Really and ultimately, one of the things that was significant with him is his emergent leadership, the stuff that he learned through that. But more than anything, he was a transformational leader, which is really the pinnacle of leadership itself. He led his regiment of Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War in Cuba, and not only did he lead them, he led them from the front on horseback. He rode into battle, leading them all into, quote, a rain of steel. And he showed them what it was like to be a leader by doing that. Many of the men in the Rough Riders actually remained committed to him for the rest of his life. And one thing he said as a quote was, in my regiment, in the whole cavalry division, the proportion of lost and killed and wounded was considerably greater among the officers than among the troops. And this was exactly as it should be. The best work can be gotten out of the men only if the officers endure the same hardships and face the same risks. And this is the kind of man that he was. You're talking about idealized influence, inspirational motivation, and individual consideration for the people under him. Even though he had inherited money from his father and was rich and really never had to do anything, he certainly did. Another thing that he did was he empowered his subordinates. Another quote, he had written to a subordinate in a letter in 1906. He said, I shall give you an entirely free hand because I hold you to an absolute responsibility for the conduct of affairs. And that's the kind of person he was, as well as he looked to empower his leaders. I think one thing that speaks probably as much as anything to Roosevelt and his leadership was his stance on diversity and what he did for diversity in culture. One of the most famous things that happened with Roosevelt was, as president, he invited Booker T. Washington to dinner. And now there's a lot to this story, and he almost didn't do it, and he was invited to the White House, and he thought, well, I'll just make it dinner anyway. But this was a big deal. At this time in history, segregation was still law, and so it caused quite the uproar in the press and around the nation, and it really made race a significant conversation at the time. It was one of the most significant events on the road to racial equality. It took a tremendous amount of courage for him to offer that, and really Washington to accept, and then to have dinner there at the White House. Again, that speaks to Roosevelt's leadership. Another thing was cross-cultural competencies for Roosevelt himself. He understood business, political, and cultural environments and working with people from different cultures. He created the U.S. Department of Labor and Commerce. He also oversaw and mediated a coal miner strike in 1902, which led to his square deal for every man. He also negotiated the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the Russian-Japanese War and won Roosevelt the Nobel Peace Prize. He also mediated the first Moroccan crisis in the Algiers Conference, stopping a potential war between France and Russia. This is the kind of thing that Roosevelt did. He knew enough about the culture, and he knew how to mediate and meet with those different people. And it was pretty amazing that he did that. He did have weaknesses. He had quite the ego, and he did not acknowledge mistakes or change his mind with folks that he knew. He said that Presidents Taft and Wilson would never measure up to him, and this led to him running again for president after being out of it for 4 years, even though he lost. It was his hubris that made him run, because he thought he could do a better job. Ultimately, his personality and motivation at some point later in his career was led by his narcissism and the fact that he thought he was better than anyone. One of his quotes that's interesting, and he has so many famous ones, but he said that no triumph of peace is quite so great as the triumphs of war, which just shows his narcissism and his ego there. So, but he was no doubt one of the greatest leaders of the modern age. He was an emergent leader. He overcame obstacles and showed courage and developed those emergent skills as a leader. He was a transformational leader by leading from the front and putting others before him. He actually declined a promotion because there was a person that he thought was a better candidate and had more experience with him when in the military. Then diversity and culture. His dinner with Washington, Booker T. Washington, his being able to be basically a master diplomatist and negotiating and mediating crises. And then I'll leave you with one last quote, one of his famous ones and one of my favorite quotes of all time. He said, "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust, sweat, and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who actually does strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither defeat nor victory." Thank you.